The Nancy Drew Files, Case Number 1, Secrets Can Kill by Carolyn Keene. Chapter 5. At the last possible second, Nancy pushed her body to the limit, twisted desperately in midair, and hit the floor with her rear end. Thank goodness not with her head. It wasn't the most graceful move she'd ever made, but as she sat there breathing shakily, she decided that it was better to be a klutz than a corpse. Nancy was tempted to prove to Carla then and there that she was ready to fight the battle, but when she got to her feet, she noticed that the gym teacher was doing it for her. "Dalton!" Miss Gibbs was livid. "This isn't the pom-pom squad. You have to use your brains in here, if you have any. Drew could have broken her neck." Which would not have broken Carla's heart, Nancy thought grimly. It would have made her day. Most of the girls had rushed over to Nancy, asking if she was all right, whether she needed to see the nurse, whether she was sure there was nothing broken. "Thanks," Nancy said gratefully. "I'm still in one piece, but I think I lost something." "What?" somebody asked. "An inch off my hips," Nancy joked, "is permanently embedded in the gym floor." 20 minutes later, Nancy took her seat in social studies. She was still slightly rattled and was hoping for a lecture so she could just take notes and get her breath back. "Okay," the teacher said gleefully. "Clear your desks of everything but paper and pen. It's pop quiz time." Nancy joined the other kids in groaning and took as long as possible finding the notebook and pen. "Don't worry," the boy behind her said. "Mr. Warner's quizzes are so bad nobody passes. If you flunk, you won't be alone." "Right," the girl to her left said. "The only one with a chance is Hal Morgan." Nancy glanced to her right and noticed that Hal Morgan was chewing his fingernails nervously. "He doesn't look too confident," she whispered. "Yeah, that's weird," the girl whispered back. "You know, it's funny. Hal has been the class brain forever. Always studying, never had time for anything else. But then this September he surprised everybody by running for class president against Daryl Gray. He didn't win, but he sure did try. I can't believe how much time he spent campaigning." "Maybe that's why he looks nervous," Nancy said. "Maybe his grades dropped during the campaign." The girl shrugged. "Maybe. But he's been talking about going to Harvard, so he must be doing something right. And his SATs were off the top of the scale." "Okay, scholars," Mr. Warner cackled. "Let's get the show on the road." By the fifth question, Nancy had decided that the boy behind her was right. There was no way she was going to pass this quiz. At least she didn't have to worry about her grade point average like everybody else. She glanced at the clock to see how much more torture she might have to go through. As she did, she noticed that Hal Morgan seemed to be having trouble concentrating, too. In fact, his eyes were on Nancy's paper. As soon as he saw her glance at him, he looked away. The teacher asked the next question, and Nancy wrote down her answer. Then she deliberately put her hands in her hair so her paper would be clear. Sure enough, Hal made a pretense of stretching and yawning, and as he rolled his head around, his eyes once more zeroed in on Nancy's paper. It was obvious, to Nancy anyway, that Hal the brain was copying her answers. But why? Why would somebody so smart bother to cheat on a pop quiz? "Well, it sure isn't going to do him any good," she thought as they passed their papers to the front. "Hal's going to get exactly what I get, which is probably a 50. She didn't think much more of the incident until after class. As she left the room, she saw Jake Webb lurking in the hall. Then she saw Hal walk up to him, reluctantly, the way most people walked into a dentist office. Wondering what those two could possibly have in common, Nancy attached herself to a group of kids who were standing around moaning about the quiz. It was hard to hear everything, but she caught enough to make her extremely curious. "Listen," Hal was saying, "I've got my own essay to write before I can get to yours." "That's cool," Jake said. "I'll give you till tomorrow. How's that?" "That's not enough time, and you know it." Hal sounded panicky. "Oh, too bad," Jake said sarcastically. "Well, I guess I don't have to tell you what'll happen, right?" Hal let out a big sigh, and Nancy saw the defeated look on his face. Okay, he said. "You'll have it tomorrow." That guy really is the pits, Nancy thought as she watched Jake walk cockily down the hall. He acts like a king, and he's got at least 2 lackeys, Walt and Hal, doing his bidding. How many others are hustling to follow his orders? And why? Why would anyone want to do anything for Jake Webb? Without really thinking about it, Nancy had begun to follow Jake, but when she saw him turn into another hall and open his locker, she decided she might learn something about him if she could see what was inside that locker. She didn't know what she'd be looking for. Money, maybe? But it was worth a try. As she passed him, she got a look at the locker, number 515, and before Jake saw her, she walked quickly to the water fountain at the end of the hall. She had to drink enough to float a ship, but she finally saw Jake's scuffed sneakers pass by and out of sight. It was lunchtime and the hall was empty. Nancy moved quickly to locker 515. A credit card wouldn't be any help this time, but a professional lockpicker's kit would. Fortunately, along with her makeup and lunch money, Nancy's canvas bag just happened to have such a kit. She found the right size pick and had the padlock off in half a minute. She pulled the door open and was ready for a leisurely exploration when she heard a voice. "Be back in a second," it said. "I forgot my psych book." It was Jake Webb. Quickly, Nancy raked her eyes over the inside of the locker. Only one thing caught her attention: a shoebox. Dangling from it was a beautiful gold bracelet exactly like Connie Watson's. That was all Nancy had time for. She shut the door and moved away just as she heard Jake's footsteps round the corner. "He has no way of knowing what you were up to," she told herself. "Just keep going." Nancy kept on going, but she was sure Jake Webb's eyes were on her back every step of the way. She was glad to get out of his sight, even though once she was, Nancy still couldn't relax. What was Connie's bracelet doing in a shoebox in Jake Webb's locker? It had to be the same bracelet. It was an antique, probably one of a kind. Maybe Connie lost it, and Jake, a lowlife that he was, found it and decided to stash it? When Nancy spotted Connie in the lunch line, she decided to make sure she was right. "Hi," she said. "Guess what? I think I know where your bracelet is." Connie jumped as if she'd been stung. My bracelet?" Nancy pointed to Connie's bare wrist. "Right, you lost it, didn't you?" Connie nodded, her eyes wide. "Well," Nancy went on, "I'm pretty sure I saw it in, are you ready? In Jake Webb's locker." Shaking her head, Connie backed away slowly, fear in her eyes. It couldn't be mine," she stammered. "I lost mine at home. I didn't lose it. I just didn't wear it today, that's all." "Connie, what's wrong?" "Nothing," the frightened girl said. "Really, nothing's wrong. I have to go. There's this meeting I forgot about. I have to go," she said again, and all but ran away. Some really weird things are going on at Bedford High, Nancy thought as she watched Connie hurry off. And so far they all lead to one person, Jake Webb. She didn't know if Jake was the phantom vandal or the anonymous videotaper, but she did know he was up to something, and all she had to do was find out what. By the end of the day, Nancy was ready to explode. First, Connie had treated her as if she had some horrible communicable disease. Then she couldn't find Walt Hogan or Hal Morgan, so she hadn't been able to question them. Plus, her rear end still ached from that fall off the trampoline. Things were definitely not going well. What she wanted most of all was to go home and soak in the hot tub. Instead, Nancy decided she'd better make another pass at the video lab. She didn't want to leave Bedford High empty-handed, not for the second day in a row. The lab wasn't locked. When Nancy walked in, the only person there was Daryl Gray, who was peering at the shelf of tapes. Suddenly, she felt happy for the first time all day. "Am I glad to see you?" she cried. Daryl spun around, startled. Then his lips parted in his Porsche driver's grin. "Nancy Drew, isn't it? The new girl?" And he glanced around the otherwise empty room. "Private Eye? How's the detecting going?" "Don't ask," Nancy said with a groan. "Anyway, what are you doing here? I didn't know you belonged to the video club." "I don't," Daryl said. "I was just doing some detecting of my own, looking for you." He came to stand within hugging distance of Nancy. "Looks like we found each other." The nearness of him made Nancy forget all of her problems. "I'm glad we did," she said. "I'm so glad, in fact, that I'm inviting you to go for a Coke right now." "Sounds great to me." "Good. I'll drive," Nancy said teasingly, "and let you see what my Mustang can do." As they walked through the parking lot, Nancy spotted Jake Webb among the cars. Probably siphoning gas, she thought. Every time she saw him, she remembered how he'd threatened her on the stairs the day before. Was that his first threat? Or had he tried to scare her off before with the videotape? Then Daryl put his hand casually on Nancy's shoulder, and she forgot about Jake Webb and simply enjoyed the touch of Daryl Gray. "How's it going really?" Daryl asked again, as they got into the Mustang. "Have you found any clues? Are any of the pieces fitting together yet?" Nancy started the car with a roar. "I never thought I'd say this," she admitted with a wry smile, "but right now, the last thing on earth I want to do is solve a mystery." Glad to be leaving, Nancy headed out of the parking lot and down Bedford Road. Daryl didn't ask any more questions about the case, and she was grateful. There'd be plenty of time to think about it later. Just then, all she wanted to do was drive. As they headed away from the high school, Bedford Road became narrow and winding. Through the trees, Nancy caught a glimpse of water. "That's Bedford Lake," Daryl pointed out. "It has some nice secluded benches. Why don't you drive down there?" Down is right, Nancy thought, as the grade suddenly became steeper. She'd been doing about 35, and all of a sudden the needle climbed to 50. A blind curve was coming up. Nancy put her foot on the brake. The pedal sank to the floor, and her stomach sank with it. "Hey," Daryl said, "I don't want to sound like a driver's ed teacher, but don't you think you should slow down a little?" Nancy couldn't answer him. The brakes were gone, and her car was shooting down the winding road, completely out of control.